The air smelled damp and heavy as Grace stepped across the threshold of Blackthorn Manor. She hadn't wanted to come here, not really. Her uncle's will had left her no choice. Still, nothing could have prepared her for the oppressive silence that greeted her now. She placed her bag on the dusty wooden table and glanced around. The furniture was draped in white sheets, giving the room the appearance of ghostly figures frozen mid-movement. Then came the sound of low, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails brushing against glass. Except there were no windows open, and no one else was supposed to be here. Grace froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Hello?" She called out, her voice trembling slightly. Her words hung in the air, unanswered. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving behind an eerie stillness that made her skin crawl. She shook her head, trying to shake off the unease settling over her. It was just an old house, she told herself. Houses creaked and groaned. It was normal, but deep down something felt wrong. The day had started innocently enough. Grace had received a letter 2 weeks ago, informing her that Uncle Arthur had passed away unexpectedly. He'd been estranged from the family for years, living alone in this crumbling estate at the edge of town. No one even knew he was sick until it was too late. Now, according to his will, the house and everything inside belonged to her. At first, Grace had considered selling it without ever setting foot inside. But curiosity got the better end of her. What kind of man had Uncle Arthur become after all those years? What secrets did this place hold? So, armed with little more than a flashlight and a vague sense of dread, she'd driven out to Blackthorn Manor, determined to see it for herself. Now standing in the dimly lit foyer, she wondered if coming here had been a mistake. Grace decided to explore. She turned on her phone's flashlight and moved cautiously through the house, her footsteps muffled by layers of dust on the floorboards. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its banister carved intricately but coated in grime. To her left, a door stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Her pulse quickened as she pushed the door open wider. Inside, what appeared to be a study lay untouched for decades. Books lined the shelves, their spines cracked and faded. A desk sat in the center of the room, cluttered with papers yellowed with age. Grace picked up one of the documents, squinting to read the faded handwriting. It seemed to be a journal entry dated nearly 30 years ago. "I hear them at night. They whisper my name. I don't know how much longer I can endure this torment." Grace frowned, her stomach tightening. Who was they? And why would anyone write such a thing? She flipped through the pages, finding similar entries scattered throughout. Each one grew increasingly frantic, filled with paranoia and fear. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. Grace shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. She looked up, scanning the shadows. Nothing moved, yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Back in the hallway, Grace continued her exploration. She climbed the staircase slowly, each step creaking under her weight. At the top, a long corridor stretched before her, lined with doors. Most were closed, but one stood partially open, revealing a faint glow emanating from within. Her heart raced as she approached. Was someone else here? Has someone broken in? Pushing the door fully open, she stepped inside. The room was small, almost cozy, with floral wallpaper peeling at the edges. A single lamp illuminated the space, casting flickering shadows across the walls. In the corner, an antique vanity mirror caught her eye. Grace hesitated, then walked closer. As she stared into the mirror, her reflection stared back, but something was off. For a brief moment, she swore she saw someone standing behind her in the reflection. When she spun around, however, the room was empty. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. "This isn't real," she muttered under her breath. "It's just an old mirror." But when she turned back to the mirror, her reflection smiled. Not the nervous half-smile she'd been wearing moments ago, but a wide, unnatural grin that sent chills down her spine. Grace stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in her haste to leave. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she fled the room, slamming the door shut behind her. By the time she reached the ground floor, Grace's mind was racing. She needed to get out of this house. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't normal. Grabbing her bag from the foyer, she headed for the front door, but the handle wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her veins. She yanked on it again, harder. This time, but the door remained stubbornly locked. Fumbling with her phone, she tried calling for help, but there was no signal. The storm rolling outside must have knocked out the cell towers. Trapped. Grace leaned against the door, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't stay here overnight. There had to be another way out, maybe a window or a side entrance. She retraced her steps, searching desperately for an exit. But every door she tried was either locked or led to another dead end. Finally, she found herself back in the study where she discovered the journal earlier. Sinking into the chair at the desk, she buried her face in her hands. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't solve anything. As she sat there, a soft breeze brushed past her cheek. Startled, she looked up. One of the windows was open now, though she was certain it had been closed before. Beyond it, the forest surrounding the property swayed ominously in the wind. Grace hesitated, then rose to her feet. If she couldn't find an exit inside the house, maybe she could escape through the woods. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than staying here another minute. Grabbing her flashlight, she climbed onto the windowsill and jumped down into the wet grass below. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop to think. She ran toward the trees, her heart pounding in her chest. Just as she reached the edge of the forest, a voice whispered behind her, "Don't go." Grace froze, her blood turning to ice. Slowly, she turned around. Standing in the doorway of the house was a figure cloaked in shadow. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated menace. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Trembling, Grace forced herself to keep moving. She plunged into the forest, branches clawing at her arms and legs as she stumbled blindly through the darkness. The further she went, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed to die away, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. After what felt like hours, she finally emerged on the other side of the woods. Gasping for breath, she collapsed onto the muddy ground. Ahead of her, the outline of a road glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Relief washed over her as she staggered to her feet. She wasn't safe yet, but she was closer as she began walking toward the distant lights of civilization. A single thought echoed in her mind. What had Blackthorn Manor done to her uncle? And why did it feel like it wasn't done with her yet? Grace trudged along the rain-slicked road, her legs aching and her mind racing. The distant glow of headlights finally appeared on the horizon, pulling her from the brink of collapse. A truck driver slowed down, his face illuminated briefly by the dashboard lights as he rolled down his window. "You okay, miss?" he asked. Concern etched into his weathered features. She nodded weakly, climbing into the passenger seat without a word. Her soaked clothes clung to her skin, and she could feel the driver's eyes darting toward her trembling hands. He didn't press for details, though just offered her a blanket and drove her to the nearest diner at the edge of town. The warmth of the diner enveloped her like a cocoon, but it did little to ease the chill that had settled deep within her bones. As she sat hunched over a steaming cup of coffee, Grace replayed the events of the night in her mind. The tapping, the mirror, the shadowy figure. It all felt surreal, like fragments of a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But one thing was certain. Blackthorn Manor wasn't done with her. As the hours passed, Grace tried to convince herself that what she'd experienced was nothing more than an overactive imagination fueled by fatigue and fear. After all, old houses made strange noises. Mirrors played tricks on you, and shadows Well, shadows were just shadows. Yet no matter how hard she tried to rationalize it, the journal entries haunted her thoughts. They whisper my name. Who or what were they? And why had her uncle written those words with such desperation? Her phone buzzed suddenly, startling her out of her reverie. It was a text from Sarah, her younger sister. "How's the house? Is everything okay?" Grace stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to tell Sarah everything, the creaking floors, the glowing lamp, the figure in the doorway, but something stopped her. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand herself? Instead, she typed a simple reply, "It's fine." Just tired. Before hitting send, she hesitated. Then, almost impulsively, she added, "Did Uncle Arthur ever mention anything strange about the house? Like voices or weird happenings?" Sarah's response came quickly, "Not really. He barely talked to anyone after Aunt Margaret died." "Why do you ask? Did something happen?" Grace sighed, closing the messaging app. No point alarming her sister, not yet anyway. But Sarah's mention of Aunt Margaret stirred something in her memory. Margaret had been Arthur's wife, and according to family lore, she'd died tragically in the house decades ago. An accident, they'd said. But now, Grace wasn't so sure. By morning, Grace had convinced herself to return to Blackthorn Manor, not because she wanted to, but because she needed answers. Selling the property would be impossible if she didn't assess its condition first. Besides, running away wouldn't solve anything. Whatever was haunting that house, it deserved to be confronted. When she arrived, the manor looked even more foreboding in the daylight. Its once grand facade was now marred by peeling paint and broken shutters. Weeds clawed their way through cracks in the driveway, giving the impression that nature itself was reclaiming the land. As she unlocked the front door, a voice behind her made her jump. "You shouldn't be here." Grace spun around to see a man standing a few feet away. He was tall and wiry, with unkempt hair and clothes that seemed better suited for a lumberjack than a neighbor. His piercing blue eyes bore into hers, sharp and unyielding. "I'm sorry," Grace stammered, clutching her bag tightly. "Who are you?" "Name's Henry," he said gruffly. "I live down the road. Used to work for your uncle before things got bad." "Things got bad?" Grace echoed, her curiosity piqued. Henry glanced nervously at the house, then back at her. "Look, I don't know how much Arthur told you about this place, but it ain't safe. People who stay here too long, they change, or worse." Grace frowned. "Change how?" He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Let's just say this house has a way of bringing out secrets people would rather keep buried. Secrets and regrets." His cryptic warning sent a shiver down her spine, but Grace forced herself to remain calm. "Thanks for letting me know," she said evenly, "but I need to go inside." Henry stared at her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Suit yourself. Just don't say I didn't warn you." Once inside, Grace decided to focus on practical matters, cataloging the furniture, checking for structural damage, anything to distract herself from the creeping dread that lingered in every corner. She started upstairs, systematically moving from room to room. In one of the bedrooms, she noticed something odd. The wallpaper near the baseboard was torn and discolored, as if someone had scraped it away repeatedly. Intrigued, she knelt down and ran her fingers over the surface. Beneath the paper, she felt a faint indentation, a seam. Her heart raced as she pressed against it. With a soft click, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passageway. Cold air wafted out, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and decay. For a moment, Grace considered leaving it alone, but something compelled her to step inside. The passage was dark and cramped, forcing her to duck as she moved forward. At the end, she found herself in a small, hidden room. The space was cluttered with objects that seemed out of place. A child's doll with cracked porcelain features, a rusted music box, and stacks of yellowed photographs. In the center of the room stood an altar-like table, covered in candles and strange symbols carved into the wood. One photograph caught her eye. It showed a young couple standing in front of the house, smiling brightly. The woman was unmistakably Margaret, her beauty, radiant despite the faded image. Beside her stood Arthur, looking happier than Grace had ever seen him. But there was someone else in the picture, a little girl, no older than 5, holding Margaret's hand. Grace's breath hitched. She'd never heard of any children in the family. Who was this girl? As she reached for the photo, the music box began to play a haunting melody that filled the tiny room. Grace froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. The sound was coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, echoing off the walls like a ghostly lullaby. And then she heard it again. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Leave while you can." Grace stumbled backward, dropping the photograph. The music grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting and writhing as if alive. Panic surged through her veins, but before she could turn and flee, the door slammed shut behind her. She rattled the handle frantically, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they formed a single, chilling sentence. "Margaret is waiting." Suddenly, the candles flared to life, bathing the room in flickering orange light. And in their glow, Grace saw her, the little girl from the photograph. Except she wasn't a child anymore. Her eyes were hollow, her smile cruel and unnatural. Grace screamed as the figure lunged toward her, and the world dissolved into darkness. Grace woke with a start, her body trembling and drenched in cold sweat. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or what had happened. Her head throbbed painfully as fragments of memory returned. The hidden room, the music box, the hollow-eyed girl lunging toward her. She blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the dim light. To her surprise, she wasn't trapped in the hidden room anymore. Instead, she found herself lying on the dusty floor of the upstairs hallway, the faint glow of dawn filtering through cracked windows. Had it all been a nightmare? A hallucination, brought on by exhaustion and fear? But as Grace pushed herself to her feet, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Clutched tightly in her hand was the photograph from the hidden room, the one showing Margaret, Arthur, and the mysterious little girl. It hadn't been a dream after all. Still shaken, Grace descended the staircase, her legs unsteady beneath her. She needed fresh air, clarity, anything to shake off the suffocating dread that clung to her like a second skin. As she reached the foyer, she heard a knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat. Who would come here at this hour? Cautiously, she opened the door to find Henry standing there, his expression grim. In his arms, he carried a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "I thought you might need this," he said gruffly, thrusting the package into her hands before stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "What is it?" Grace asked, unwrapping the parcel. Inside was an old journal, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. "It belonged to Margaret," Henry explained. "Arthur gave it to me years ago, told me to keep it safe. Said it held answers about why things went wrong." Grace flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. Most of the entries were mundane: a grocery list here, a note about gardening there, but others hinted at something darker. "I hear them too now. They whisper when I'm alone. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but they know my name. Alice won't stop crying. She says the shadows are watching her. I don't know how much longer we can stay here." Alice, that must have been the little girl's name. Henry watched her intently as she read. "You've seen her, haven't you?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. "In the hidden room, she attacked me." Henry sighed heavily, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "That explains a lot. What do you mean?" Grace demanded, her voice rising slightly. "The house feeds on guilt," he said bluntly. It preys on regrets, secrets, pain. Whatever's haunting you, whatever skeletons you've got buried, it'll drag them out until you break. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Was that why she was seeing Alice? Because the house knew something she didn't. Determined to uncover the truth, Grace spent the rest of the day poring over Margaret's journal. Each entry revealed more about the family's tragic history and the sinister nature of Blackthorn Manor. Margaret wrote frequently about feeling watched and hearing voices late at night. Over time, her entries became increasingly erratic, filled with paranoia and despair. Then came the final entry. Arthur doesn't believe me. He thinks I'm imagining things. But Alice isn't safe here. Neither am I if anything happens to us. Don't let them take her back to this place. Promise me. The words sent a jolt of realization through Grace. What if Alice hadn't died in the accident everyone believed? What if she'd survived and been left behind in the house? Desperate for answers, Grace confronted Henry. Did Alice survive the fire? She asked point-blank. His face darkened. No one knows for sure. After Margaret died, Arthur disappeared for weeks. When he came back, he said Alice was gone. Some folks thought she'd run away. Others said. He trailed off, shaking his head. Said what? Grace pressed. That the house took her. Armed with this new information, Grace resolved to search every inch of the manor for clues. She started in the basement, a place she'd avoided until now. The air was thick with dampness, and the flickering beam of her flashlight did little to dispel the oppressive darkness. As she rummaged through cobwebbed shelves and rusted tools, she stumbled upon a locked chest tucked away in a corner. Using a crowbar she'd brought with her, she pried it open. Inside, she found a collection of personal belongings, a child's sweater, a stuffed rabbit missing an eye, and most chillingly, a locket containing a picture of Margaret and Alice. Beneath these items lay another journal, smaller and more delicate than Margaret's. This one belonged to Alice. Grace's hands trembled as she opened it. The entries were brief, written in shaky, childish handwriting. One passage stood out. Mama says we have to leave, but Daddy won't let us. He says the house needs us. I don't want to stay. The shadows hurt. Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she realized the horrifying truth. Uncle Arthur hadn't lost his family to an accident. He'd betrayed them. He'd kept them trapped in the house, feeding its insatiable hunger for suffering. And now, decades later, the house was doing the same thing to her before Grace could process what she'd learned. The lights flickered violently, plunging the basement into near total darkness. Her flashlight sputtered, casting erratic beams across the walls. From the shadows emerged a figure tall, gaunt, and unmistakably familiar. Uncle Arthur. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his lips curled into a cruel smile. You shouldn't have come back, he whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally. The house always gets what it wants. Grace backed away, clutching the journals to her chest. But as she turned to flee, she felt icy fingers wrap around her ankle, dragging her backward into the abyss. Above her, the shadows coalesced into the shape of a little girl, her hollow eyes gleaming with malice. No, Grace choked out, fighting against the pull. Please. The last thing she saw before being swallowed by darkness was Arthur's ghostly grin. And then, silence. Grace awoke to the sound of whispers, soft, insistent murmurs that seemed to come from every direction at once. Her body ached as though she'd been dragged across jagged rocks, and her throat was dry and raw. Blinking against the oppressive darkness, she realized she wasn't in the basement anymore. Instead, she lay on a cold stone floor in what appeared to be an unfamiliar part of Blackthorn Manor. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and decay, and faint, flickering lights danced along the walls like dying embers. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt weighted down, as if invisible hands were pressing her into the ground. Panic surged through her veins as memories flooded back, Uncle Arthur's ghostly figure, the icy grip around her ankle, and Alice's hollow-eyed glare. Grace clenched her fists, forcing herself to breathe steadily. She couldn't afford to lose control, not now. "What do you want from me?" she whispered hoarsely into the void. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they formed words. Not just any words, her own thoughts, spoken aloud by voices that weren't hers. "You don't belong here. Why did you come back? It's your fault." Each accusation cut deeper than the last, dredging up guilt and regret she'd buried long ago. Memories she thought she'd forgotten resurfaced with startling clarity. Arguments with her parents, harsh words exchanged with her sister Sarah, moments when she'd chosen self-preservation over helping others. It was as though the house had peeled back every layer of her soul, exposing her deepest flaws. And then, amidst the cacophony, a single voice rose above the rest. A child's voice, trembling yet accusatory. "You left me." Grace froze, her breath hitching. Slowly, she turned her head toward the source of the voice. Standing in the shadows was Alice, her small frame illuminated faintly by the flickering lights. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her loomed the translucent figures of Margaret and Arthur, their faces twisted with anguish and anger. "Left you?" Grace stammered, struggling to make sense of the accusation. "I didn't even know you existed until yesterday." Alice tilted her head, her hollow eyes locking onto Grace's. "You always leave," she said softly, her voice laced with sorrow. "Just like Mama and Daddy." Grace's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to deny the accusation, but deep down, she knew it was true. Throughout her life, she'd avoided responsibility, pushed people away, and fled whenever things got too hard. Even coming to Blackthorn Manor had been motivated by curiosity rather than familial duty. Maybe the house wasn't wrong about her. After all, as the weight of her failures settled over her, Grace felt something shift within her. For so long, she'd run from pain, burying it beneath excuses and distractions. But here, in this suffocating darkness, there was nowhere left to hide. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I should have done better. I should have stayed." The whispers faltered, their intensity waning slightly. Encouraged, Grace continued, her voice growing stronger despite the lump in her throat. "I can't change the past, but I can try to fix what's broken. If you'll let me, I'll stay to help you, to free you. Just tell me what I need to do." For a moment, silence reigned. Then, slowly, Alice stepped forward, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Find the truth," she murmured. "Break the cycle." Before Grace could ask what she meant, the room began to dissolve around her. Shadows melted into light, and suddenly, she found herself back in the hidden room where everything had begun. The music box sat open on the altar-like table, its haunting melody still playing faintly. Determined to uncover the truth Alice had hinted at, Grace returned to the journals she discovered earlier. This time, she approached them with fresh eyes, searching for connections she might have missed before Dot and Margaret's journal. She found a cryptic entry near the end. Arthur made a deal. He'd promised them we'd stay forever if they spared us. But they lied. They took everything anyway. Grace frowned, her mind racing. Who or what had Arthur made a deal with? And why had he betrayed his family? Her search led her to one final discovery. Tucked inside the lining of Alice's journal was a folded piece of paper. When Grace unfolded it, she gasped. It was a map of Blackthorn Manor, but not the version she knew. This map depicted tunnels and chambers hidden beneath the house, marked with symbols she didn't recognize. One symbol stood out, a circle intersected by 3 lines, labeled simply as the heart. Following the map, Grace ventured deeper into the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the manor. Each step took her further into darkness, both literal and metaphorical. The whispers returned, louder now, urging her to turn back. But she pressed on, driven by a newfound resolve. Finally, she reached a massive chamber at the center of the tunnels. In its middle stood an ancient stone pedestal, atop which rested a glowing artifact, the source of the malevolent energy permeating the house. The symbol etched into the pedestal matched the one on the map, the heart. Grace approached cautiously, her pulse pounding in her ears. As she drew closer, visions assaulted her mind, snippets of Arthur's life leading up to the tragic fire. She saw him making desperate deals with shadowy figures, sacrificing pieces of himself and eventually his family for fleeting promises of safety and power. But the most shocking revelation came when she touched the artifact. A surge of knowledge flooded her mind. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was the ghost. Built centuries ago as a prison for a malevolent entity, Blackthorn Manor had absorbed the pain and suffering of everyone who entered, using their regrets to grow stronger. And now, it has chosen Grace as its next victim. Summoning every ounce of courage, Grace gripped the artifact and focused on the emotions coursing through her. Grief, guilt, fear, but also hope. She thought of Margaret and Alice, trapped in limbo because of Arthur's selfishness. She thought of Sarah, waiting anxiously for news. And she thought of herself, finally ready to confront her mistakes instead of running from them. With a cry of defiance, Grace shattered the artifact against the pedestal. Light exploded outward, blinding her momentarily. When it faded, the chamber was silent. The oppressive weight lifted. Exhausted, but triumphant, Grace stumbled back toward the surface. As she emerged into the pale morning light, she felt lighter, freer than she had in years. Behind her, Blackthorn Manor crumbled into ruin, its dark secrets buried forever. Grace stood at the edge of the property, watching as Blackthorn Manor collapsed into itself like a house of cards. Dust and debris billowed into the air, carried away by the wind that had finally returned after years of unnatural stillness. For the first time in days, or was it weeks, she felt calm. Hollowed out, yes, but also strangely whole. The artifacts. Destruction had broken the cycle, freeing Margaret, Arthur, and Alice from their torment. As the house fell, Grace swore she saw 3 figures standing among the ruins, bathed in golden light. They didn't speak or move. They simply watched her with expressions of quiet gratitude before fading into nothingness. But even as the physical remnants of the manor disappeared, its scars remained etched into Grace's soul. She knew she couldn't leave this place unchanged, not after what she'd endured, not after what she'd learned about herself. Over the next few days, Grace stayed in a small inn on the outskirts of town, processing everything that had happened. She called Sarah frequently, though she avoided mentioning the supernatural horrors she'd faced. Instead, they talked about simpler things, childhood memories, shared regrets, hopes for the future. One evening, during one of these calls, Sarah said something that stopped Grace cold. "You know, Mom always said Uncle Arthur changed after Aunt Margaret died," Sarah remarked thoughtfully. "She used to say he became obsessed with, I don't know, fixing things. Like he blamed himself for what happened and spent the rest of his life trying to undo it." Grace frowned, recalling the vision she'd experienced while touching the artifact. Arthur hadn't been a monster. He'd been a man consumed by guilt, driven to desperate measures to protect his family. In the end, his efforts had only made things worse. "I think you're right," Grace admitted softly. "He did try to fix things. He just went about it the wrong way." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Sarah asked hesitantly, "Are you okay? You sound different." Grace smiled faintly, staring out the window at the setting sun. "I'm getting there." As the days passed, Grace began piecing together fragments of her own life, much like she'd pieced together the truth about Blackthorn Manor. She realized how often she'd run from responsibility, how many relationships she'd let slip through her fingers because confronting pain seemed too difficult. But the house and Alice had shown her another path, one of accountability, empathy, and resilience. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Determined to honor that lesson, Grace reached out to people she'd distanced herself from over the years. She apologized to an old friend she'd argued with years ago, reconnected with a former mentor who'd once meant the world to her, and even visited her estranged father. Each conversation was awkward at first, but gradually bridges were rebuilt. She also started volunteering at a local shelter, finding solace in helping others navigate their own struggles. It wasn't redemption, it was progress. And for now, that was enough. 2 months later, Grace returned to the site of Blackthorn Manor, where the sprawling estate had once stood. There was now only an empty field overgrown with wildflowers. She knelt down, placing a bouquet of lily on the ground, a tribute to Margaret and Alice. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat, "for showing me the way forward." As she rose to leave, a gentle breeze rustled the flowers, carrying with it the faintest trace of laughter. Grace smiled, knowing she'd done all she could to set things right. Months turned into years, and Grace eventually settled into a quieter, more intentional life. She wrote a memoir about her experiences at Blackthorn Manor, not to sensationalize the horror, but to share the lessons she'd learned about facing fear, embracing vulnerability, and breaking cycles of regret. The book became a bestseller, resonating with readers around the world. Many wrote to thank her for giving them the courage to confront their own demons, whether literal or metaphorical. One letter stood out in particular. It came from a young woman named Emily, who described herself as trapped in a nightmare within her own home. Grace recognized the desperation in her words immediately and responded personally, offering advice born from hard-won wisdom. "Sometimes," Grace wrote in her reply, "losing everything is the only way to find who you really are. Don't be afraid to face the shadows. They may hold the key to your freedom." Emily never replied, but Grace hoped her words had helped, even in some small way. On the anniversary of her escape from Blackthorn Manor, Grace visited the field again. This time, she brought no flowers, only herself. Standing amidst the tall grass, she closed her eyes and listened to the wind. For so long, she'd feared the darkness, the unknown, the unseen. But now, she understood that true strength lay not in avoiding it, but in walking through it, one step at a time. When she opened her eyes, she noticed something unusual: a single red rose growing where the foundation of the house had once been. Its petals shimmered faintly in the sunlight, almost as if alive. Grace knelt beside it, brushing her fingertips lightly against its velvety surface. "Goodbye," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Then, for the first time in years, she walked away without looking back. The end.